AV.
Hola, buenos días a todas, a todos. Bienvenidos a la segunda sesión de este curso Modern Money Theory, perdón, que nos está impartiendo el doctor Randall Gray. El día de ayer vimos algunos elementos sobre, digamos, los orígenes históricos, el concepto del dinero deuda y la idea del dinero chartal, ¿no? Hoy vamos a continuar con el tema de Minsky y la teoría del dinero moderna, ¿no? Entonces, les agradecemos otra vez su participación y su atención y sin más le doy la palabra al Dr. Ray. Please, Professor Ray.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about Minsky, but not the stuff that Minsky is best known for, the financial instability hypothesis. I'm going to be focusing on aspects of his writings that are incorporated within MMT. And because we got onto a topic yesterday that I didn't have any slides for or time to talk about, I also have added another topic that I'm going to cover. So the original syllabus only had the first two articles listed. I'm going to also present some material from that third article there on budget deficits and growth, assuming we have time. Okay, so this is to repeat from yesterday. These are the approaches that have, I believe, been synthesized within modern money theory. And I just wanted to point out, because I went through this yesterday, notice that Minsky is in every one of them. Okay, so Minsky is involved in all of these approaches that become integrated within MMT, and that's why I think it's perfectly consistent to argue that Minsky is extremely important to MMT, at least the version that came out of Kansas City, University of Missouri, Kansas City. Okay. So a couple of quotes that will sound very familiar to material from yesterday. But the first one is, Minsky used to always say, anyone can create money, the problem lies in getting it accepted. So I'll go through that. Anybody can create money. The second one we covered yesterday, something that Warren Mosler had said, but Minsky also had said this long ago. The need to pay taxes means that people work and produce in order to get that in which taxes can be paid. In other words, taxes drive money. So additional things we didn't talk about. Minsky also said bank money is valuable because we owe the banks. You can see that that's the same principle. Taxes drive money, but also bank loans drive money because many people, maybe most people, owe the banks, and you repay your loans to banks by using bank money. So your debt to the banks drives your demand for bank money, which is demand deposits. So it's a similar principle. Taxes drive the demand for money, but loans drive the demand for bank money. So in general, its obligations drive money demand. And then Minsky also talked about the money pyramid, which, again, we covered it yesterday, but I'm going to go into it in slightly more detail today. Okay, so from the very beginning, Minsky had an endogenous money view. He argued that money is a unit of account, which sounds similar to stuff I talked about yesterday. This was also Keynes's view. We start from the money of account. And then we have IOUs denominated in money. Okay, so in the case of America, we have the US dollar is our money of account. And then we have our IOUs denominated in dollars, and Mexico denominated in pesos. Banks are firms. So Minsky treated banks like any other for-profit firm. It's trying to make profits. It's seeking profits, And if we put barriers to try to constrain what banks will do, they're going to innovate and get around the barriers. That's sort of their job. If there's something in the way of making profits, they're going to try to get around it. And this was Minsky's earliest work in the 1950s. Remember yesterday I said that we put lots of constraints on the financial system with the New Deal reforms. Minsky warned in the 50s, those reforms might have worked, but the banks are starting to get around them. Okay. They're always going to be innovating. And you may not know that Minsky's original dissertation advisor was Schumpeter, who's very famous for his theory of innovation. Innovation drives capitalism. Minsky took that theory of innovation, which for Schumpeter was mostly the industrial firms are innovating, and Minsky applied it to the financial system. It's also always innovating. Okay, the role of the central bank, Minsky always argued, is the first and foremost important role of the central bank is lender of last resort. Okay, it's not controlling the money supply, it's lender of last resort. It also is involved in supervising and regulating, which I talked about yesterday. Minsky saw that as an important role of central banks. I said I'm sort of biased against it because in the case of the Fed, they're not very interested in doing that. But Minsky had hope. And then they set the interest rate target. Now, when Minsky was saying this 40 years ago, it was somewhat controversial. Today, everyone agrees on that, okay? But why are you raising interest rates or why are you lowering them? Minsky would disagree with the orthodox thinking about where you should be setting your rate. Okay, and so finally, central banks can't control the money supply, so you don't give them a task that they can't do. You saw the pyramid yesterday, so I'll just flash it up and just add concepts from Minsky. So we have the government liabilities at the top, households and small businesses at the bottom. So that's the pyramid. So the dimensions are, as we move down the money pyramid, go from government down to households, the liabilities that are issued become less and less liquid. Okay, so liquidity preference was a concept of Keynes. And Keynes had used that term money things. I said, I don't like things. Money records is better than things. So as we move down, they're less liquid. Convertibility. The IOUs lower in the pyramid are made convertible to those higher in the pyramid. So if we look at banks, their liabilities are convertible to government liabilities, bank reserves. So a bank's demand deposits are convertible to central bank reserves. And if we go down to, say, the short-term liabilities of non-financial institutions, those will be made convertible into bank liabilities. Okay, so you promise to convert your IOU to an IOU higher than you are in the pyramid. And then the last one is clearing. Agents lower in the pyramid use the liabilities of agents higher in the pyramid to make payments. So banks will use the central bank's liabilities to make payments with each other. They clear using central bank reserves. Non-financial firms will make payments using financial firms' liabilities. They're higher in the pyramid. So you use liabilities higher in the pyramid to make payments. So those are the dimensions. Okay, let's move to Minsky and fiscal policy. And there, about, 8 years ago, there was some debate about whether Minsky accepted Lerner's functional finance approach, which I mentioned yesterday, but I will tell you more about what it is, or whether he rejected the functional finance approach. Okay, so I'll talk about what it is. And Lerner was famous also for the money as a creature of the state theory of money. approach. So we'll see whether Minsky accepted it or at least was consistent with the principles of functional finance. My own experience as a student with Minsky, so this is in the early 80s, I don't remember him ever talking about Lerner functional finance. When I got to know him personally, he talked about Lerner as a very close friend. The families were friends. Minsky's children thought of Lerner as Uncle Abba. Okay, so they were very close. Lerner was a little bit older and so further along in his career, and he was sort of a mentor for Minsky. So I knew that they were close. But I never heard Minsky talk about Lerner in terms of his theories. I knew Lerner as a microeconomist. So the stuff of his that I had read was micro. Many of the contributions to neoclassical microeconomics was actually Lerner. Okay, he probably should have gotten a Nobel Prize for those contributions. The only thing that struck me with Minsky was he rejected the notion that the government can drive the economy like you can drive your car using the steering wheel. He would make references to the steering wheel view, and he completely rejected that. No, you cannot drive the economy like it's a car. You cannot fine-tune the economy. So he is very clear on that view. There's no such thing as driving the economy straight down the road. Can't be done. Okay? And I had known that Lerner was famous for this, but I'd never read that work. So that seems to be against Lerner's view, but he never explicitly said it. Okay? What he did talk about was targeting your spending. And in class, he did mention the notion of the government must be the employer of last resort. And it was very clear he wanted full employment and he wanted the government to be responsible for that, but not by pumping up demand. You have to directly target jobs to the unemployed. So it's clear his fiscal policy was targeted spending, not general increasing aggregate demand. Okay, so now let's continue. I did not know, though, that he had written a lot on employer of last resort. He never said, oh, you should look at my writings in the 60s. I didn't know it existed. If you read the Stabilizing book, the 1986 book, he talks about employer of last resort. It might be 2 paragraphs. That's it. And so I did not think he had ever really developed this idea. He just had borrowed it from the New Deal. So FDR had a jobs program, and he'd say, yeah, the jobs program, we should do something like the CCC for young people, okay, or something like the WPA. It was only after he died when I was going through all of his papers at the Levy Institute, sort of trying to get him organized. He was not an organized person. He would have 20 copies of a paper and various versions of it, all of them just thrown, scattered between file drawers. So anyway, I found that he had a lot of the off prints, which you used to get if you published in a journal, you got an off print. So he would have off prints of articles, or he had drafts of these articles. Okay, and so then I started looking and found he wrote more on this than anything else in the 60s. Okay, so he's famous for financial instability hypothesis, but he's spending all this time on the job guarantee. And I found out that he actually was involved in the debates of the time. There were letters from Sergeant Shriver. I know that name won't mean anything to you, but I think he was the brother-in-law of President Kennedy. And he was invited to dinner with Hubert Humphrey, who was vice president with LBJ. So Minsky was involved in the debates in Washington of the time. So I'll talk about that. So it was more than just academic work. He was pushing the idea. Okay. We republished a lot of this work into 2013 in a little volume that you can buy, I think, on Amazon. So that has a collection. It doesn't have everything he wrote, but it has a collection. Okay. So what was going on? Kennedy, well, let's back up. In 1960, there was a book that was published called The Other America. So in 1960, we come out of World War II and our economy booms. We created the middle class in the United States. And we sort of thought that poverty was gone. And this book comes out by Michael Harrington, The Other America, and said he documented poverty all over the United States, 1960, The Other America, it exists. And that started Kennedy's war on poverty. Kennedy was assassinated in 63, so the law wasn't passed. It was passed by Johnson in 65, that committed the US government to eliminating poverty within a generation. So we're going to get rid of it. So the debate was about how are you going to do it? And I'll come back to what they actually did. Minsky was involved in that debate and creating the policies that would end poverty in America. Okay, so Minsky's main points, when you read through these papers, he argued a true war on poverty must include a commitment to full employment. Okay, so you have to be committed to full employment. You can't solve poverty just with welfare programs. You got to create jobs. Second, the responsibility has to be the national government. Only the national government. When he says state, he doesn't mean like California. Okay, this is the national government. Only the national government has a financial capacity. So only the national government can afford to supply a job to everybody. National government can't run out of money and it doesn't need to make profit. So private firms can't do it. And charitable organizations or state and local government can't do it. Okay, and then so his proposal is employer of last resort. I'll go into a little bit of detail what it is. He modeled it on the Roosevelt's New Deal. It's a universal job guarantee. Okay, so anyone who wants to work will be given a job offer. And also everyone in the program earns the same wage. It's a universal wage. Now, there are lots of different kinds of job guarantee programs. These have become popular over the past 2 decades in the US and around the world. The UN put out a report last year advocating for a job guarantee to end poverty all over the world. But the proposals vary. Some of them will have higher wages for more skilled people and low wages for less skilled people, and so on. But Minsky wanted everyone in the program to get the same wage. That, and the reason why was because that would become the minimum wage. Minsky in class, he loved to ask students, what's the current minimum wage in the United States? And so someone would raise their hand and say $1.25 an hour. Now it's more like $7.50. And Minsky would say, no, it's not. It's zero. The minimum wage in the United States is zero. Because if you can't find a job, you earn zero. The only way to have an effective minimum wage is to have everybody employed. So you have to have the job guarantee to have an effective minimum wage. Otherwise, if you can't find a job, you're earning zero. So he wanted it to set a wage floor. That's the purpose. There will be no job in your country that pays less than the minimum wage. There could be some exceptions. You might be willing to go to Hollywood and be a stand-in below the minimum wage because you're hoping to become an actor, okay? But you do it voluntarily. no private employer can otherwise pay below the minimum wage because you can always go to the government's program. Okay, so it becomes a minimum wage. It takes workers as they are, where they are. Okay, so it's a universal job guarantee. You don't have to go graduate from high school first. Okay, you don't have to have any particular skills. You don't have to know how to read or write. You're going to get training on the job. So he doesn't want a program where it tells you, okay, if you will go learn to read and write and get some skills, then we will hire you. We'll hire you and we will teach you while you're working. So he thought training should be part of every job. He compared this kind of a job guarantee program to agricultural price supports. So one of the other New Deal programs was price support. The government guaranteed a price for corn, and then they stockpiled the corn that they bought. They would buy corn whenever the market price dropped below the floor price, and then they would sell corn whenever the corn price rises. That helps to stabilize the price of corn. Okay, so you want to set the price high enough so farmers can survive, but not so high that poor people can't survive, right? Price support program sets floors, and that's important. It cannot cause inflation. Okay, it sets a floor price, but it doesn't cause inflation because you don't chase the market price. When the market price goes above, the government doesn't raise its price to try to buy more corn. It leaves the price where it was and it just doesn't buy any corn. He argued the fixed universal wage will do the same thing for labor. This is how you can have full employment, defined as anyone who wants a job at the going wage can get a job without it being inflationary. It cannot be inflationary. Price floors cannot cause prices to go up. Okay, they only go up to the floor. After that, they don't push prices higher. All right, now, why do you need that? Because the great fear of full employment beginning in the late 50s was the Phillips curve. Full employment will cause inflation. Okay, full employment with a job guarantee designed this way cannot cause inflation. It's impossible. So that's why he set it up this way. The national government pays the wages. Now, Minsky also was modeling his on the job programs of the New Deal. Those were not only paid for by the federal government, they were managed by the federal government for the most part. In the 60s, Minsky still believed the federal government could manage the programs. Later, I can remember talking with him at Levy, and he would just out of the blue, he'd say, do you believe that the federal government has the competence to manage a program like this anymore? And he said, I'm not sure. So by the 80s, Ronald Reagan was president. He doubted the federal government would be able to run the program. So that's why the MMT proponents of the job guarantee program have argued we need to decentralize the management of the programs. So the federal government supplies the wages, but it doesn't necessarily run the programs because maybe we don't have policymakers competent enough anymore. During the Depression, the Roosevelt administration ran these programs. There were 13 million people in the WPA. They built America's infrastructure. America was an undeveloped country in 1930. It's hard to believe, but it was undeveloped. The jobs programs built the airports, the roads, the schools, the post offices, and got us ready for World War II. Okay, that's what the New Deal jobs programs did. So the government was very competent then, but it's no longer competent. So the federal government will provide the wages, but maybe it won't run it. Minsky argued there should be projects in every community, and there should be benefits to everybody, not just to the workers. Okay, why is that? Because most people are probably not going to be in the program. Most voters are probably not going to be working in the job guarantee program. And they will see the government spending money on workers for these programs. If they don't get benefits from it, the program won't be popular. So he wanted everybody to benefit. There should be benefits you could see. So the job program would do useful things that would benefit communities. So that was very important. Okay, that will build the, it's not that you have to do a program that way. That's just to get political support. People need to see it. And people saw the benefits of the New Deal programs. You got a new post office, you got a new school. So the benefits were obvious. Okay, now, what was the alternative? The Keynesians won. The job guarantee did not win the debate. The war on poverty was based on the Keynesian approach. And by that, I don't mean Keynes. I mean the American Keynesians who bastardized the general theory. It's Paul Samuelson, Jim Tobin, Robert Solow. These are all good people, okay? But their version of Keynes, Robinson called bastardized because we don't know who the father was, but we know the mother was neoclassical economics. So it's not really based on Keynes, was the point. Anyway, the idea was that all we will need to do is keep demand, aggregate demand high enough, operate the economy so it's growing fast enough, jobs will trickle down to the poor, and that'll solve the poverty problem. Plus, they were going to focus on boosting demand by providing incentives to invest, to grow faster. And then also, they were going to include job training, education, and welfare for those who should not, maybe cannot, maybe will not work. Okay, so it was a combination of those things. So Minsky argued against this. This is the Keynesian version of trickle down. The supply side trickle down we get much later with Reagan. And that is the notion that we give tax cuts to the rich. That makes them so happy, they invest, and that creates jobs. That's supply side trickle down. But what dominated in America until the 80s was Keynesian trickle down. The idea that we boost aggregate demand and it doesn't really matter what you spend on, that will create jobs that trickle down. So that's a demand side trickle down, not a supply side trickle down. Okay. At the time, Minsky wrote, the war on poverty is a conservative rebuttal. It's not progressive, it's conservative rebuttal to an ancient challenge of the radicals that capitalism necessarily generates poverty in the midst of plenty. Okay, so he saw it as conservative, not progressive. Without a jobs program that takes the poor as they are, he predicted the war on poverty would fail, and it did fail. It didn't reduce poverty rates. Stephanie Bell Kelton and I wrote a piece in 2004. So it's, how many years is that? 50 years, or 40 years, 40 years after. And we looked at the poverty statistics before the war on poverty, after the war on poverty. Did poverty rates go down? No. There was one group for which poverty rates did decline, but they already were declining. And that was for Black Americans. And that's primarily because they moved out of the South to the North. Okay, so that trend continued, but otherwise poverty rates did not go down. So the war on poverty was not successful. So without a jobs program, it's going to fail. Instead of providing the impoverished with an opportunity to work, it provided them with the opportunity to learn how to work. So in other words, we'll train them, but we're not providing the jobs. And it was worse than that because there also was this belief that the poor, this was not there in the beginning, but it became Daniel Patrick Moynihan's argument as to why people are poor. It's because of their behavior. They behave in a way that is a barrier to them getting good jobs. So we need to change their behavior, make them act more like white middle-class people, and then they'll be more employable. So that was a really, really bad aspect of it. So changing behavior too. The problem with the Keynesian approach, Minsky predicted, is that it's going to cause inflation and financial instability. The combination of tax cuts and military Keynesianism. Now, most of the Keynesian writing was advocating increasing spending. But if you actually look at what the governments did, even under Democrats, whenever unemployment was rising, they would cut taxes. So cutting taxes has always been the first line of defense against rising unemployment. Increasing spending was the second line, but they did a combination of the two. And they did that to try to promote investment. Minsky argued what this does is it biases demand to the leading sectors of the economy, the sectors that are the most advanced, industrial, with unionized workers, with high pay. And much of that was for defense spending. Typically, that's the most advanced sector in the economy, building weapons. And if you bias your spending toward that sector, it's going to be inflationary. Why? First, because the workers are unionized. Easier for them to get wage increases. Second, the firms don't mind paying higher wages. Why? Because they're on government contracts. It's cost plus markup. They're going to get their profits. The higher the costs, that's all covered. Okay. And then they get to add their markup to get their profits. So they didn't care if wages went up. So it was going to be inflationary, he argued. The high investment strategy biased the economy toward rising private debt. Why? This is part of the financial instability hypothesis. A portion of investment is externally financed. So if the government is promoting investment, firms will be using debt for part of the finance of the investment project. So debt will be rising, private debt. Minsky saw private debt as dangerous. So you're going to be promoting financial instability too. An expansion led by the private sector increases private indebtedness and financial fragility as the debt service payment commitments rise. So I'm not going to go through the financial instability hypothesis, but you can see how that fits into this argument. It's going to tend to create financial instability. It's going to have an inflation bias. So he said the stance that policy will have to take is a go, stop, go. So you stimulate the economy, government orders a whole bunch of new military equipment and gives tax cuts for investment incentives. And then you start getting inflation. So what do? You slam on the brakes. Okay, you stop, cut back on spending, trying to fight the inflation. And then you get unemployment. So what do? You step on the gas. You start spending. So you go through this cycle of go, stop, go. So you can't keep the economy growing on a constant pace. All right. So that's what Minsky was warning about in the 60s. Now, at the end of the 60s, we did get inflation. And that sort of put a stop on the Democratic parties push the war on poverty and big government and all of that. And it seemed to prove that there is a Phillips curve. It seemed to prove you can't have full employment without inflation. The problem was there was too much government spending. But the problem is that we got a recession in 74, and then we had inflation and unemployment at the same time. For a whole decade, we had what was called stagflation. So that's a combination of inflation and unemployment at the same time. And the problem was that the inflation, unemployment combination meant the Keynesians had no answer. Okay, what was the Alba Lerner's principles of functional finance? Government should spend more if there's unemployment. That's the first principle. So what's the functional purpose of fiscal policy? To ensure full employment. Spend more. Government should supply more money, and he meant bank reserves, if the interest rates are too high. So this is the monetary policy. Monetary policy should ensure that the interest rate doesn't get too high. The budget itself should be functional. And what that means is that the debt outcome, whether the government spending leads to a deficit and increases government debt, should never be a primary consideration. So that's why you're focusing on the functional outcome, not on any preconceived idea about how much debt is too much or how big of a deficit is too big. So that was Alba Lerner's functional finance. I told you I never heard Minsky talk about it, and I never thought he had written about it. But after he died, I found a manuscript written by him and Irma Edelman, 1960. At the very top of the paper, they say, much of the following is related to the principles of functional finance. And he actually cited Lerner's famous book, which is the steering wheel book. He said, an old-fashioned assumption underlies this paper that full employment and price stability are compatible. Why is he calling it old-fashioned? Because the Phillips curve had come around in 1959. So before the Phillips curve, this was accepted. He says national debt is unique, for there's no default risk. So he recognized a sovereign government with its own currency cannot be forced to default. The only risks are that the interest rate and the price level might change. Okay. The total wealth of private units equals the value of things in the economy. So that's the real wealth, plus the value of the national debt. He recognized that the government's debt is our net financial wealth. Okay. That plus real assets is total private sector wealth. Of course, within the private sector, some people are debtors and some people are creditors, but those cancel out. So at the aggregate level, the only thing that's left is government debt. That's our national wealth. The total wealth of private units equals the best policy is a low interest rate with national debt growing at the same rate as private debt, and both of those equal to the rate of growth of productivity. Okay, he has a little model in the paper that demonstrates that this is going to lead to the best possible outcome. What's important here is to recognize, first, he's advocating a permanently low interest rate. Second, he's absolutely fine with the national government's debt growing. Okay, so a growing debt is not only okay in his model, it's necessary. okay? And it needs to grow as fast as private sector debt, okay, to keep the financial system stable. And both of those equal to the rate of growth of productivity, okay? In 1960, I don't think that paper was published, but in 1963, he published another paper in the American Economic Review where he said a government-led expansion is more sustainable than a private sector-led expansion. And the reason was because government debt is risk-free, private debt is not. So you can get financial instability if it is the private sector leading economic growth. You need the government to lead economic growth, and it's perfectly fine for the government to be issuing debt. Okay? So what I'm saying is this is all pretty consistent with Lerner's functional finance approach. You don't worry if the government has a budget deficit, that's perfectly fine. Okay, in 1968, he seems to take a more nuanced position, and he continues with this. He said he had thought that tight full employment should be 3%. And he thought you could achieve that through a general increase of aggregate demand. And so he saw that as a goal, even if you don't have a job guarantee. So just trying to create jobs by increasing aggregate demand. But in 1968, he says that it can't. Why? Because pushing the unemployment rate down to 3% by increasing aggregate demand is going to increase financial instability and create credit crunches where there's problems in the financial markets. And it will produce inflation. Growth won't improve and might increase inequality. Okay. The thinking of the Kennedy Keynesians was that a rising tide lifts all boats. This was a very famous statement that everyone was saying. We don't need to target our programs to the poor because if we just have a rising tide, it will raise the boats of the poor too. Minsky is saying that that's not true. It's likely to increase inequality, not lifting the boats of the poor. Okay, so it won't improve and might increase inequality. And let me just say, if you read the work of Pavlina Cherneva, she has shown that has been true for every expansion since 1960. Every expansion increased inequality. It didn't reduce it. Okay, but if you think about it for a second, the rich are going to benefit the most from a growing economy, and they're going to be able to protect themselves the best from a bad economy. They're powerful. Okay, so it shouldn't have been surprising, but it was to Keynesians at the time. So we must pay attention to the structure of aggregate demand. We need directed aggregate demand. So the spending has to be directed. We need employer of last resort to achieve and sustain tight full employment, not trickle down, but bubble up. In other words, target the bottom, and then growth will bubble up. It will raise boats of other people too, but you raise the boats at the bottom first. It'll reduce inequality and enhance price and financial stability instead of causing inflation and increasing financial fragility. If you target the bottom and have government-led growth, not private sector-led growth, then you won't produce financial instability and inflation. So the budget stance is important for price, currency, and financial stability. You need a counter-cyclical swing of the budget. So if the economy is growing really rapidly, you need the budget to shift toward a surplus, less deficit. Okay, he's not saying you have to achieve the surplus in order to avoid bankrupting the government or anything like that. What you need to do is to reduce the stimulus coming from the government. And if the government is running a surplus, it's taking income out of the economy. That will help slow it down. In the early post-war, we needed government debt as a safe asset, and that was leveraged for growth. We came out of World War II with a government debt ratio of 100% of GDP. So private portfolios were full of government debt, which was a safe asset. And then they could sort of leverage that safe asset by issuing private debt to finance investment that led to growth of the private sector. So it was leverage for growth. But now, too much government debt led to the Fed moving away from using the discount window to using open market purchases to get reserves into the system. Okay, and remember, I said yesterday, Minsky always wanted banks to have to go to the discount window. That was a way to discipline what the banks were doing. Now the Fed was buying government bonds, putting reserves into the system with no kind of constraints on the banks. So we're losing control of the banks. The impact of the budget on the economy depends on where spending and taxing are directed. Military spending and transfers are welfare, unemployment compensation, things like that, are less productive, so they're more inflationary. Unproductive spending means the US loses a competitive advantage and we end up with a current account deficit. So he's worrying about the current account deficit. A large outstanding stock of government debt makes it much harder to use countercyclical deficits to stabilize the economy. It's harder to move the budget toward a surplus if you have a lot of government bonds out there because you have to pay the interest on those. You can't cut that. Okay, that's what's going on in the United States right now. $1 trillion is being spent per year on government debt. Okay, so everyone's looking at the size of the deficit and growth of the debt. Well, what is driving it is interest payments on the debt because the interest rate is so high. All right, so anyway, you have to pay the interest even in the upswing. So you will continue to run a deficit. You'll come back to all of these ideas because it gets much worse with Reagan. But you already saw it coming. Okay, I told you that I never heard him talk about functional finance, and until he died, I never saw him mention it in his writing. A few years ago, around 2016, a professor at Westminster College who had invited him to speak in 1991 found they had a video and he posted it online. And I used to also think that there was no videos of Minsky, but a few have popped up. So now you can find a very few videos of him speaking. Anyway, the sound in this video is terrible, but Google it and you can watch him and try to figure out what he's saying. He didn't speak very clearly anyway, but the audio is really bad. At about 45 minutes in, he's talking about the New Deal programs that created productive capacity, which I mentioned before, made us a developed country. He says, now the spending is on transfer payments, military, and interest on debt. It's not resource creating. Now he's talking right now, this is 1991. Okay, this is his talk in 91. The problem is the American debt is higher than ever before. We need the government steering wheel. Okay, says it right there, to ensure income remains high enough to service it. So now here he's talking not just about government debt, private sector debt is so high, we can't have a recession. Because if we have a recession, we're going to have a financial crisis. Okay, so we have to keep the economy growing. Until 1980, so this is before Reagan, government debt was declining as a percent of GDP. So over the whole post-war period, the debt ratio was going down from 100%, not because any debt was retired. It was just because GDP grew. Okay, so the government debt ratio was going down. But with Reagan, we had a recovery and we still had a deficit of 5% of GDP. So the bold statements here are the ones that created a lot of controversy. The quality of government debt in international markets is deteriorating. The quality of US government debt is deteriorating. What does that mean? Does it mean that the government is a credit risk? That maybe the government will default? So that's why there was a big debate about this. There's no question of affording it. Okay, so apparently he's not worried about default. But we lack the will to raise taxes to validate it. Okay, what does he mean by validate? Government must validate our debt with taxes. That sounds like he's saying, you know, we got to pay off our debt using taxes. Okay, so try to figure out what he means. And then he brings it up again in 65 minutes in. Taxes are the price you pay for civilization. Okay, that's sort of a joke. People have probably said that for thousands of years. We're not now in the position we were in the 60s. Now we have competitors, the yen and the mark. Now, that might seem hilarious now, but this was serious in 1991. The US was worried that the yen and mark were going to become the international reserve currencies, and it was completely plausible then. Of course, absolutely impossible now because there is no mark. And because Japan never grew after 1991. But in 1991, I think 17 of the world's biggest top 20 banks were Japanese. They were buying Hawaii and New York. Americans were really worried about this. Okay. So anyway, he's worried about the competition in the foreign exchange markets. We increase the proportion of income coming from interest. In large part, assets are held abroad by higher income people and by the fire sector. So we're paying lots of interest, including the federal government, paying lots of interest. It's going to foreigners. It's going to high income people where that's increasing inequality, but also their propensity to consume is very low. So the point is, this spending is just leaking out of the economy. And it goes to the fire sector, finance, insurance, real estate sector. Okay, so it's not doing us any good. We're in danger of becoming Argentina. Now that sounds terrible, right? Argentina collapsing. Spending without taxes. It means printing money, and it could lead to inflation. So that sounds like a monetarist. The alternative to taxation is the inflation tax. That's the idea that the bonds that you're holding go down in real value, right? That's an inflation tax. So it sounds like he's violating Lerner. Okay, so what was going on? One, it was a lecture, not a written paper, and people say things at lecture that they maybe don't mean, maybe they regret later or whatever. Now, I had seen in his writings from 1986 much of this. And I always, and my students would, raise questions about it. And I thought it's probably mostly a reaction against Reagan. He really hated Reagan. This was the time where we were living with Reagan when I met him. So, he could be sort of irrationally hostile about Reagan, okay? Or is his thought really changing? Is it evolution or revolution? Did he abandon functional finance? Was he becoming a deficit hawk or a deficit dove? Those are Stephanie's classifications, really balanced budget, or you should balance the budget over the course of the cycle. Or is it grounded in the writings? So the 84, 86 writings where he talks about Reaganomics, I, of course, had read all those. But after he died, I found he was writing a book at the Levy Institute in the 90s. So he was updating all of his ideas. He died before he could put it together and publish it. But I was using that in classes at the time. And so you can go through the book manuscript. By the way, there's an archive of Minsky's writings at the Levy Institute. Just go to the Levy website and you'll see Minsky archive. And not everything, but a huge proportion of what he wrote is there, including potential chapters from the manuscript. Okay, so going back to 86, he wrote a paper, Stabilizing an Unstable Economy. Sounds a lot like the textbook, the book, right? He said the tax reduction of 81 compromised the revenue system. As a result of its tax cuts, the deficit remained at depression levels, even as the expansion took hold. So this was bothering him. Our economy is expanding, but the deficit is not going down. It's like we're in a depression. Because of the deficits, the national debt increased by about 1,000 billions or $1 trillion, which was a lot of money back then. That means the revenues needed for any given spending program, any given desired deficit is now 100 billion greater. What's the 100 billion? That's the interest payments. So now we have to make $100 billion of interest payments, no matter what we do with spending or taxing. So we've got to come up with much more money to get to a balanced budget. In his 86 book, he said, a government can run a deficit without suffering a deterioration of its creditworthiness. That sounds like there could be a default. If there is a tax and spending regime in place that would yield a favorable cash flow, that is a surplus, under reasonable and attainable circumstances. Now, notice he didn't say you have to achieve that. He just said it has to be possible. So you don't have to balance your budget, but you must be able to balance your budget with reasonable projections of the economic growth rate, the tax rate, and all of that, okay? Something that could be attained, you don't have to attain it. He concluded there will either be a run out of the dollar or a debt repudiation through inflation. So this is what he was worried about. Run out of the dollar into yen and marks, so the dollar gets displaced, or we get inflation that reduces the real value of bonds, which could lead to a run out of US government bonds. So it's not really default. It's that people won't want to hold them. Okay. So the problem isn't that the government will run out of money or default in nominal terms, but there's pressure on the dollar exchange rate or pressure on the Fed to increase interest rates. Pressure on the dollar could generate a run out of the dollar. Higher rates can cause capital losses on the longer term bonds. That's what we saw with Silicon Valley Bank. If the Fed raises rates, you crash the bond market, and higher inflation reduces purchasing power of interest income. In 1994, so this was when he was at Levy, he said, after spurious prosperity, largely based on an unproductive government deficit, expansion of the financial services industry, and financing schemes that left the country with an excess supply of office structures and so on, the economy has stagnated for 5 years. In the early 90s, we were in what people were warning is a secular stagnation. Okay, sort of what Japan has had since 1994. So there was a huge fear. Wally Peterson wrote a book on it, the secular stagnation of the economy. So he was worried about that. Furthermore, government spending became even more inefficient as an instrument to create resources because the high interest rates means we have this huge item in the budget, which is paying interest on debt, which for the reasons I said earlier, it's going to rich people, it's going to foreigners, it's going to the banking system. It's not helping the economy. It's not producing productive capacity. The Reagan, Thatcher, Bush experience is the second failure of the laissez-faire model. What's the first failure? 1929, when we crashed into the Great Depression. So we have the free market system is failing in 1994. So we can't meet the performance standards of the 50s and 60s anymore. I can tell you when Clinton was running, Minsky had great hope for Clinton. He was a big supporter of Clinton. But Clinton comes in and his first term is not good. The economy did not recover. Minsky died in 96, and coincidentally, the economy started growing and people stopped worrying about secular stagnation. The economy did come back to perform sort of like the 60s. Legacy of Reagan, growing international indebtedness, losing fiscal independence. So the Reagan era saw a vast increase in government debt and a shift in the international indebtedness. The United States becomes down below the major debtor. We were the world's biggest creditor. We become the world's biggest debtor. Okay. And we're going to be forced to face up to our changed position. It is unlikely unless fiscal wisdom prevails. So he's worried about our relation with the rest of the world. In the draft manuscript, this is picked from different writings between 91 and 93. The spending side requires a large overhaul. The Keynes phrase, socialization of investment, means the government spending program needs to finance resource creation. So he wants to shift government spending to create resources like the New Deal did. Income from work, where if necessary, the work is provided by government, should replace transfers. Minsky was always hostile to welfare. And I never understood why. I thought he was just trying to poke me and get me upset. But after I discovered, it's because he wanted the job guarantee. And then he always said that, of course, we should supply welfare to the people who cannot, will not, or should not work. Okay, jobs first, though. So that's why he always emphasizes this. Such a package of reforms where the government debt, though growing, is always in principle, i.e., when the economy is at a close approximation to full employment, being validated by revenues. So you want to start approaching a balanced budget when you're at full employment. Okay, so that's what he means. So did he violate the principles of functional finance? I think you can make the argument both ways. No and yes. So no, he had a more nuanced view. It matters what the government spends on. Okay, so that is different because Lerner did not make that argument at the time. He recognized there could be inflation pressures. And those can occur before full employment. If you're spending on the advanced sectors of the economy, you're going to get inflation before you get full employment. Before the jobs trickle down to the poor, you're going to get inflation. He took account of the change in international position of the dollar, and he's very worried about that. And he incorporated his theory of financial instability. Okay. On the other hand, Lerner also abandoned it, but much more thoroughly. And the reason was inflation. In 1977, he wrote this paper, and it's really amazing how far he recants. He embraces monetarism. He says, my functional finance had been too focused on the macro and neglected the micro or market analysis. It led to stagflation. He proposed a peace settlement between Keynesians and monetarists and sound and functional finance. What he wanted the government to do would be to issue wage increase permits. It's sort of like pollution permits. So if a firm wants to raise wages, that's like a pollution because it's going to contribute to inflation pressure. So they have to buy a permit and you limit the number of permits so you don't get inflation. Okay, so he thought that would prevent wage increases that would be inflationary. He set a rate of money growth equal to, the government should set a rate of growth of money equal to real output. Who does that sound like? That's exactly Milton Friedman. Put control of aggregate demand in the hands of the Fed. Central banks should be controlling aggregate demand, not fiscal policy. Divorce the government budget from the total level of aggregate demand. Focus fiscal policy on social efficiency. internalizing externalities, alleviating poverty, government, and any increase of government spending should be offset by an increase of taxes. Balanced budget. Fiscal policy has to be a balanced budget. Okay, so he completely reject functional finance because of inflation. And by the way, Minsky and Lerner were very close, and Lerner probably is actually the source of stability is destabilizing. Minsky credited him. So everyone thinks that was Minsky. It was Lerner. Lerner read Minsky's JMK book and wrote a review of it that he sent to Minsky. And Minsky was very offended. It was taking on topics that Minsky really had not taken on. It really was just an attack on post-Keynesian economics. Okay, concluding functional finance. Minsky shared the money as a creature of the state and functional finance approaches. The first concerns fiscal capacity, and the second is policy recommendations. Post-war Keynesians like Minsky and Lerner recognize sovereign government doesn't have a solvency constraint, so that's not the problem. And that fiscal policy should be directed to full employment. So both Minsky and Lerner agreed on that. But Minsky quickly moved to directed spending, and even Lerner later abandoned the notion of a steering wheel approach because of stagflation. Lerner's rejection of functional finance was more thorough than Minsky's. He embraced monetarism. Minsky's version was always more nuanced. He rejected mechanical Keynesianism and an institutionalist approach because that was his background at Chicago. So let me make sure. Yeah. So this concludes the part on Minsky. So if you want, we could do questions on Minsky before a break. Do we have time?
Yes, we need a break.
Okay. So are there questions on this part? Because after I'm going to go back to fiscal policy and MMT.
Yes, it's about how the balance stains is important for prices, money, and stability, finance stability. In order to combine all these objectives, the importance that the budget, yes, it should be directed in favor of the productive capacity in order to avoid trade deficit, no? In order to stabilize the exchange rate, in order to generate, how do you say, multiplier effects in favor of the income of the enterprises, households, and the government, in order to increase the revenues. Yes. The problem is that in open economy, a lot of public spending go for imports and generates trade deficit, and the situation compromise the stability of the currency and compromise the stability of the finance, the finance sector too.
Yeah. Well, Minsky definitely wanted to develop the productive capacity, improve the infrastructure. I mean, he would talk about how bad America's infrastructure was compared to Europe's. And he was worried about trade deficits, and he wrote several pieces on tariffs. He supported using tariffs to promote domestic output. I probably will write a short piece on that because they're sort of scattered, his writings on that. I didn't think he had written much, but I found some. He did write on international topics, not very often, but he did write on them a bit. Others?
Hi, thank you. I have a quick question about the monetary curve. Is horizontal or semi-horizontal in this perspective? Because it's very interesting for me to understand the indigenous money in Minsky view. What do you think about it? Thank you.
Well, Minsky never drew a money supply curve. His early writings are pretty similar to Steve Russeus's view, which was that if the demand for money increases, what happens is the banks innovate, and it's as if velocity goes up. So in the late 50s, this was a pretty common view among post-Keynesians. So their version of endogenous money was the velocity goes up. And so it doesn't do the central bank any good to try to control the money supply. As Kaldor's Radcliffe Committee argued, velocity can just go up to substitute for it. Or we produce new kinds of money that aren't included in the Fed's measure and maybe can't be controlled by the Fed, money substitutes. So this was Gurley and Shaw. So Minsky, I think, had a similar view. When later, Basil Moore in 1979 was the one who started talking about a horizontal money supply curve, I don't think Minsky ever was fully on board with that. He had a draft paper from Basil Moore, which I think probably was the one that came in the JPKE, I think published in 84. So probably around 82, I came to the office and Minsky tossed a paper to me and said, see if you can make any sense out of this. And it was the one where Basil Moore talked about lagged reserve accounting versus contemporaneous reserve accounting and argued it would make no difference at all. So Minsky had it. He just didn't seem that interested in the debate about whether we really should think of it as being horizontal. I don't think Minsky would have, because he believed that banks do underwriting and they care about their own balance sheets. So what they're doing when they're making loans is they're leveraging their capital, and they operate with rules of thumb about how much they're willing to expand and their asset side by leveraging their capital. And even if everyone is the same risk, increasing the leverage ratio on capital is exposing the bank to the risk of bankruptcy. So I don't think he would go all the way to horizontal.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. My question is about the public and private partnerships and how is this challenging these visions of the how it's called direct investment, direct spending about the government, or how they change this idea of how sorry, about the work, no, the state being the job guarantee, how this public partnership could help or could not to fulfill this goal.
Okay, so as I said, in Minsky's writings, the vision was the federal government ran the programs, so he didn't have partnerships. The UMKC version of the job guarantee is that these will be not for profits. It's not really a partnership. What the federal government is doing is taking in proposals. So let's say your local Red Cross, and you already have operations in some city, and you put forward a proposal. You say, if we could get 5 job guarantee workers, we would be able to expand the services we can provide. And the proposal is evaluated at several different levels. And then if it's approved, what the federal government does is it pays the wage bill for those people. That's it. Now, you're going to be evaluated periodically to make sure that you're doing what you said you would do so you can continue to have those people paid. Okay? So that's how it would be done. There'd be qualifications for submission of proposals. We don't want for-profit firms to do it because then the incentives are different. It's trying to make profit, but also you're competing with other firms that don't get job guarantee workers. So you have an unfair advantage. The government is paying your workers and the other one doesn't have government paying their workers. So we don't have the private sector at all. There's great disagreement across job guarantee proposals. Phil Harvey and Sandy Darity, Derek Hamilton, they would have everyone in the job guarantee program a federal government worker. Okay, we think that will be a bit of a problem. First, the capacity to run those programs. Second, what you're doing is you're increasing the total federal workforce from, I'm not positive, I can't remember anymore, 3 million workers to potentially 23 million, because we think there could be 20 million workers that would come forth for a job in the job guarantee program. Of course, it depends on the business cycle, but you could have 20 million people in there. You are increasing the size of the federal workforce tremendously, which creates management problems, but also huge political problems. Suddenly we have a President Trump who is going to fire all of them. Okay. So anyway, I think you get many more problems with the politics if it's a federal government program. And what if some of the projects turned out to be corrupt? Then it's a federal government corruption problem. What if it's a local Red Cross turns out to have a corrupt leader? It's one, and it's Red Cross. It wasn't the federal government that did it, it's the Red Cross. So I think it puts some distance between the federal government and the programs themselves. Yep. Well, it's the government is allocating spending to your program. So you submit the Social Security number. That's how we keep track of employment in the United States. Okay, here are the Social Security numbers. The government makes the wage payments to them as long as they're doing the work. The government could also supply. We studied job guarantee programs around the world. There actually have been lots of them. Most of them are small. Some are big, like India's. And it's typical to require about 20% overhead for materials, supervision, and all that. So maybe it's wages plus 20% to the not-for-profit. So that covers some of the costs. Oh, who has it?
Thank you, Professor Ray, for your great exposition. I'm talking about the Minsky instability hypothesis. I think about the American debt, which is astronomical number of $35 trillion in these days. What do you think? Can you share your opinion to us about what would do the U.S. government about this fact? Because as you write once, the sovereign is not obligated to pay his own debt, especially in an era of one Peter Thomas and Grandfellow, as you write in 2022. What do you think that Minsky would have done, what would have right? Minsky. Thank you very much.
Okay, so after the break, I'll talk a bit about the debt, where we are now, and whether it's a problem or not. Minsky was worried about interest payments on the debt because they're inefficient. Okay, so it's not necessarily the amount of spending, it is what are we getting from the spending. Wasteful spending that isn't adding to capacity is not increasing our ability to provide. And it's not competing with foreign production. So we become reliant on imports. So Minsky's worried about all of those issues. Then he also is worried about the inflation issue. If you have a huge, say, $35 trillion of debt out there and the government has to pay $1 trillion of interest, it makes it much harder for the budget to move sufficiently to act as a drag on the economy. So if the economy starts booming, we can't get the budget to shift enough to take enough demand out to cool down the growth. So he's worried about that too. We're not in that position now, even with $1 trillion of interest spending. Our economy is not in danger of overheating. What inflation we've had nothing to do with excess aggregate demand. So I don't think we're in that position. But I will talk more about the sustainability of the debt after the break. Okay.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My question is about the affordability of the employer of last resort program in countries that doesn't have the hegemonic currency. That is the case of Latin America. Because I understand that in the United States, you can afford these kind of programs by issuing money and taking debt. But in Latin American countries, if a country issues too much money, there is a big risk of devaluation and inflation. And also, we face restrictions on debt because we have to take debt from international institutions and usually in dollars. So how a country without the hegemonic currency can afford these kind of programs? Thank you.
Well, except most Latin American countries do have their own currency. They can afford the job guarantee program. Ecuador dollarized, so we can leave them out. They need dollars for a job guarantee program, but other countries don't. Mexico doesn't need dollars for a job guarantee program. Now, the danger is that if you have a job guarantee program where everyone can work at the whatever that program's wage is, that you could get inflation from too much demand for your own output. Probably not likely. You could pressure the exchange rate because you're going to increase imports. That's likely. And so it's not that you can't afford to do it. It's that there are consequences of doing it. So what do you need to do? You need to implement a job guarantee program in a way that will minimize those consequences. Okay. Argentina had a job guarantee program, the JEFES program. We went down 4 times and studied it. So one of the things they did is rather than paying wages in money, they paid in kind. And the workers produced the output. So that's a way to minimize both inflation, if you were worried about that, but also exchange rate effects, because it's not imported and they are producing it. Okay, so if you can provide at least some of the wage package in kind, you're reducing the bad consequences. And then what you want to do is make sure the employment is productive. So that's another way to reduce the consequences. So import substitution, which was always the answer in the past, it's still the same answer. What you put the workers to do is to increase your own capacity to produce so that you don't import. And what do most poor countries import? Food and energy. So you focus on those, try to increase your capacity to produce food and energy so you import less. Now, of course, some developing countries are energy producers, I know, but typically those are the two problems. So you need to increase your own capacity to produce those. So it's not affordability, okay? It's consequences. You don't need to go to the IMF and ask for dollars so you can pay workers wages in pesos. It doesn't make any sense. You're going to pay in pesos and you can't run out of them. So if you want to see work, Fidel Kaboub, who was from UMKC, and he's from Tunisia, has written a lot on what developing countries need to do to deal with the kinds of problems you're talking about.
Pues tomamos un descanso, 15 minutos, regresamos a la segunda parte y las preguntas que quedaron pendientes, guárdenlas para la segunda sesión, por favor. Gracias.
Okay, I'm going to get a little deeper into fiscal policy. There's some questions at the end yesterday, so I realize I probably should do some of this. Okay, in graduate school, you learn what the sustainability condition is to make sure that the debt ratio won't go to infinity, which is believed to be unsustainable. So anyway, the mainstream says it's okay to borrow, especially if you're in a recession, as long as your economic growth rate, which is G, is greater than the interest rate, R, then the debt ratio won't increase without limit. But the problem is that increasing government spending tends to slow the growth rate because it crowds out private investment. It's not as efficient as private spending. And it raises the interest rate because the government competes for a limited supply of savings or of lending, depending on whether you have loanable funds or a more modern theory. So it pushes up the interest rate. So that makes it likely the condition won't be met, right? Your growth rate is going to be falling, your interest rate going up. You're probably going to get the interest rate above the growth rate. The debt burdens the grandkids who have to pay it back. So this question, do you really ever have to pay it back? And it can result in secular stagnation. The alternative to borrowing that the government has that you don't have is the government can just print money and pay for it. But the problem with that is it causes inflation, and almost certainly you're going to get to hyperinflation. Okay, Paul Samuelson has this very interesting interview by Mark Blaug around 1974, I think it is. If you Google it, you can find it. It's fascinating. But he goes through this a long quote, but I'll just summarize. What he says is, keep a secret. The necessity of balancing the budget is that old-time religion we use to scare politicians and the population so they'll behave themselves. We know it's not true. You don't need to balance the budget ever. Okay. Bernanke, before Congress, when the Fed was bailing out Wall Street after the global financial crisis, the Fed spent and lent $29 trillion to save Wall Street, plus the global financial system. So Bernanke was called before Congress. Where are you getting all that money? Is that taxpayer money? And Bernanke said, no, it's not tax money. We simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account. It's a keystroke. We don't use any tax money. Now, he was talking about the money the Fed was spending, but the same is true, as I talked about yesterday, when the Treasury spends. The Fed makes all payments for the Treasury, and it's all a keystroke. So it's also true of government spending. Greenspan was called before Congress by Paul Ryan, who thought he knew what the answer would be. That's why he called Greenspan. He wanted to slash Social Security spending because it's projected to run large deficits and become bankrupt. And so Greenspan shocks him by, for once, telling the truth. Greenspan says, the United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that. There is zero probability of default. Okay, now I don't like the term printing money. It's keystrokes, as Bernanke said. Okay, so I'm just pointing out, even the most mainstream economists understand government cannot be forced to default. They will never run out of money. It's keystrokes. Okay, so the simplified sustainability condition, though, is growth has to be faster than the interest rate. And then there's a variety of reasons to believe why that won't happen. Now, this constraint tells you it's not necessary to prevent deficits. Deficits are perfectly fine. You don't need to stop the debt from growing. It's okay to have a growing debt. They just don't want it to grow without limit, okay? And you never need to repay the debt. So all those things are accepted by the most mainstream economists. But the arguments are that deficits can slow growth and drive up interest rates. There's the Ricardian equivalence argument. It's almost too silly to repeat, but lots of economists believe this, that when consumers see the government is running up debt, they will stop consuming and increase their saving because they know they have to repay the debt. If you're a rational consumer, that's what you're doing. Of course, no consumer does that because it would be completely irrational. Say, because the debt is growing, I'm not going to consume. Of course, they don't do that. Anyway, it's got all the causation wrong because, as Keynes says, investment creates savings. So you can't increase saving. That's the paradox of thrift. In the ISLM model, you get transactions crowding out that drives up interest rates. There's always this claim that, oh, eventually the bond vigilantes will go on strike and refuse to buy the bonds, so the government won't be able to borrow. Okay, so the takeaway from all of this is a rising deficit and rising debt ratios should be associated with higher interest rates and slower growth. Okay, so if you take all of this, even admitting that it's okay to run deficits and debt, the problem is you should see interest rates going up and slower economic growth, the bigger the budget deficit relative to the size of the economy. Okay, on the other hand, there's a Keynesian view that deficits boost aggregate demand. So you would think growth would increase. It can be used as a counter-cyclical stabilizer. A rising deficit ratio could be associated with recovery growth. So you might see a positive relationship between deficits and growth, not a negative relationship that the mainstream says. And furthermore, government could use discretionary policy to boost growth. So the government wants to grow faster, so it spends more to produce growth. There's still an inflation danger, but you could see a positive relationship between deficits and economic growth. Okay, there was some question about does the government ever have to pay off the debt, or is there some limit to the debt ratio? The debt ratio of the government, US government, so that's federal government debt to GDP ratio, has been growing since 1789 at a 2% pace. That ratio is growing. It's not that the debt is growing. Debt has been growing faster than GDP since the founding of the United States. And so my response to anyone who asks, can that keep going on? Anything that can continue for 250 years probably can continue. Okay. But anyway, I thought, why don't we just see who's right? Let's plot the deficit ratio on the vertical and the growth rate on the horizontal and see if the mainstream is right, it should be a negative relationship. If the Keynesians are right, it should be a positive relationship. And what do you see? It's a scatter plot. There's no obvious relationship. Maybe stare at it long enough, you know, humans by biology can see patterns in absolutely random dots. Always, they can find a pattern. So if you stare at it long enough, maybe you can come up with something. But it's not obvious that there is a relationship. Sort of strange. Well, we already had this idea of good deficits and bad deficits. It's actually in our textbooks. And I decided to try to diagram it and see then if I can make sense of the data. So if we start at point A, the economy is growing at a moderate pace. The deficit ratio is low. What happens if you go into recession? We start moving to the left. The growth rate is going down, and the automatic stabilizers will kick in their welfare spending will go up, unemployment compensation goes up, and tax revenue goes down. And in the United States, it collapses. I'll show you the data. So the deficit will go up. So you're going to move to point B, okay, in a recession. That's an ugly deficit. You get a deficit because the economy goes into recession, okay? Now you have a deficit. The deficit is adding spending to the economy. The economy starts to recover. Okay, you're at a higher deficit ratio, but the growth rate starts to pick up. You could move toward point C. Okay, so that's getting a bad deficit, and then you get a recovery because of the bad deficit. Or what if you're at point A and you say, well, we're not growing fast enough. We're going to use discretionary policy to increase government spending. So you're a Keynesian. Then you can move to point C. That's a good deficit. You decided to spend more. But because the economy is growing faster, tax revenue is going to boom. And so you're going to move from point C to point D. The deficit ratio will go down, but growth is picked up. Okay, so that is a good deficit. It promoted economic growth. And it's self-limiting. The deficit will start to go down because the economy picks up speed. All right. So I thought, how are we going to plot this? How can I look at all those dots and try to draw the diagram of how we move through time? And I actually started trying to do that. Yeah, it's extremely difficult. But luckily, Yeva, I said, why don't you plot them for me? I don't know how she does it. Excel, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, I did it for the whole period, but I just chose recent decades here. And we see there's a really typical pattern. So if we start in 2001, we had the dot-com bubble collapse, and we're in a recession. The economy starts to grow, and we had a Clinton budget surplus, which is what caused the collapse. Okay, and we moved from a surplus of almost 2% of GDP to a balanced budget, then to a deficit. Economic growth picks up, and then we go into the global financial collapse. Okay, so that's why we have this sharp turn to the left. That's the global recession, and the deficit goes to 10% of GDP. Okay, then we start to recover. And so we move to the right, economic growth picks up, and then the deficit starts declining. It goes down. We start approaching a budget surplus, and then COVID, the deepest recession we've ever had. And so we go to a 15% deficit. Some of that was automatic, but a lot of it was fiscal relief by Biden, then Trump, $5 trillion of spending. So we have well, it's not an all-time record post-war budget deficit of 15%, then we recover, and the deficit starts coming down. Okay, so that's what it looked like. So then I've done this for, I'll show you in a second how many countries, I don't remember. All in the paper, approximately 10 countries. Everyone looks the same. Everyone goes through these loop-de-loops, every country that we've looked at. What if you plot all the countries in one graph like I did with the United States? Okay, so here are the countries, and Mexico is included if you want to read the paper. Again, there's no obvious thing. It does seem to be slightly downward sloping. Okay, but there's great variation for any deficit ratio. You could have any rate of growth. There's no obvious impact of deficits. And it's because you get both good and ugly deficits. So then I had a co-author, a BART student, say, why don't we identify the good deficits and the bad deficits? And so we did it for every country. And just about every country has both kinds. So defined ugly deficits, if you have slow growth and a growing deficit for 3 or more years, that's an ugly deficit. A good deficit, you have rising growth and a growing deficit for 3 or more years. And you see most countries do both. China had no ugly deficits. Russia had no good deficits, okay? And then decided to relax the conditions for good deficits. If you have 2 or more years, then you'll see countries have more good deficits than they do with the harder hurdle. But again, most countries have both kinds of deficits. Let me focus in on the United States. This shows the budget of the US deficits or surpluses. There's 0. And the shaded areas are recessions. And you can see there's a very close pattern here. Recessions are always associated with rising deficits. And surpluses or falling deficits is a very good predictor of a recession. If you have a falling deficit, you're going to get a recession because the government is taking too much spending out of the economy. Well, too much of your income, so you can't spend. So that's what happens. So it's very clear. Why does the deficit go down before the recession and then up? Why is it swinging like that? Well, it could be because of taxes, or it could be because of spending, right? It could be the taxes or tax revenues increasing. It could be spending is going down. So this separates the two. And we see that both of those swing, and the tax receipts fall sharply in recessions, and they go up before recessions. So tax receipts, because the economy is doing well before recession, the tax receipts are rising and they take demand out, and then you get a recession. In the past, the spending side was also very cyclical. Okay, it goes up in bad times, it goes down in good times. That's exactly what you want. If you have a good social safety net, that's what spending will do automatically. Okay, and so we're focusing on the transfer payments. So it's unemployment and various kinds of welfare spending. But what happened is that Clinton ended welfare in the United States. He promised to do it and he did it. And so now it hardly swings. You can see that the swings are all taxes. There's not much spending swinging. Now, COVID, it would be different. It's not included here. COVID swing is very big, but very unusual. This is just focusing on the global financial crisis. Here we have the transfer payments and the tax receipts, but also the third category, which is government consumption kind of spending. Okay, so the other spending that's not transfer payments. And you can see how fast tax revenue was growing. Okay, this is quarterly change. It's growing by 20% a quarter. Tremendous. And then it falls off a cliff. Tax revenue disappears. And I looked in more detail, what kind of taxes is this? In the US, we have 2 main kinds of income taxes. Income taxes are the biggest source for the federal government. 2 kinds. One is withheld taxes. I mentioned Beardsley Rummel came up with this idea because people get to April 15th and the average household had saved no money to pay taxes, and they had all their taxes due. So of course, they were in big trouble. He said, let's take out taxes at every paycheck, withheld taxes. So working people pay withholding taxes. People who work on Wall Street pay their taxes quarterly and then at the end of the year. There's no withholding because you don't know what their income is going to be. If they have a good year, they get a $2 million bonus at the end, right? It's that kind of income. That's what drives that. It's rich people. It's not workers. So their tax receipts declined tremendously in the recession. And that's what drives the budget deficit. So it's mostly taxes that drive the budget. Now, I'm not claiming this is true for every country. This is the United States. We don't have a social safety net, much of one. And for the most part, the tax rates on high income people tend to be low, but they get big bonuses and that can bring in a lot of revenue. Okay, moving on to address Minsky's concerns. The US transitioned from an exporter and a creditor to an importer and a debtor. Okay, so I'll be approaching that. So when Godley came to the Levy Institute, I didn't know his work. Minsky went to the Levy Institute in 1990. I went in 1991. When Godley, I think, was recruited partly by Minsky. Minsky knew him. And he came to the Institute, I think it was around 1992. And he brought the sectoral balance approach. I had never heard of it, although, as I said yesterday, Minsky did all the balances in his mind and he made me do them too. So it wasn't a shocking idea at all, but his framework I had never seen before. So at the aggregate level, the sum of the private domestic sector and the government sector and the foreign sector balances has to equal zero. Okay, all that's saying is that if $1 is spent, somebody received it, right? So if we take the government sector, G is government spending, T is taxes. So if this is a positive number, it's a deficit. Plus the private sector's balance, which is investment minus saving. Now, this is using the GDP accounts when Godley uses the flow of funds. The flow of funds is better, more accurate. The problem is hardly any countries have flow of funds accounts. So you can use this in any country because you can get the GDP accounts. This is an approximation. Okay, so I mean, it is an identity. You want an identity. It's an approximation of what's going on in the private sector. So it's investment minus saving. If that is positive, it means you're running a deficit. You're investing more than the savings. Okay, so it's a deficit. And then finally, the foreign sector, that's the balance against the rest of the world. Net exports, if it's positive, it means that you're exporting more than you're importing, so you have financial flow, your direction, you have a surplus. All right. So if we rearrange this, well, let's skip that for a second. If the external balance is zero, a government deficit means that the private sector has a surplus. Now, most of the time when Minsky is writing, he's ignoring the foreign sector. And so in his writing, when he's talking about this balance between if the private sector is doing really well and in a balance, then the government sector ought to also be in a balance. Okay, that is running a balanced budget. But you can't do that if you're an importer, because the government's deficit has to offset your deficit against the rest of the world too. So once you open up your economy and once the trade balance matters, then you have to consider your position relative to the rest of the world. Minsky never had to consider that because we could pretty much ignore it until the Reagan years. We ran surpluses And so they were always adding to our private sector saving. But after Reagan, they're always subtracting our private sector saving and making it more likely that our private sector is running up indebtedness, which is what is the danger. So given the USA runs a persistent current account deficit, I would say for us, a normal current account deficit is about 6% of GDP. That's about where we will be if our economy is doing well. So that's very big. In order to have the private sector just have a balanced budget, okay, not running a surplus or a deficit, our government deficit has to be 6%. So for us, a 6% government deficit is perfectly normal. Okay. If it's anything less than that, it means our private sector is running up its indebtedness. So we get financial fragility. So if you don't want a financially fragile private sector, if this is going to be a -4, this has got to be a -4. Deficit of 4, okay? Here is the United States. Since 1960, the red is the government. Now, this is all levels of government, but it's driven by the federal government. Our state governments are required by their own constitutions. 48 of them have to balance their budget. Generally, they are close to balancing their budget. In really bad recessions, some states will run a deficit, and they immediately have to change their budget because they are a credit risk. They can default on debt, and the bond markets will boycott them. So they will fire their police, they'll lay off their teachers, they will get back to a balanced budget. So it's the federal government really that's running the deficit. And you can see that deficits are pretty normal. And the same would be true all the way back to 1929. The last time we had run a significant budget surplus was 1929. And what happened? The Great Depression. Before that, we had had 5 other periods where we had a budget surplus. And what happened after each of those? Depressions. We've had 6 depressions. People only remember the last one, which is the Great Depression, okay? But we've had 6 of them. We were 6 for 6. 6 times we had a budget surplus. We had depressions. And then Clinton, we ran a surplus. And Clinton was on TV, and he projected, he actually had a magic marker, and he drew the line, and he showed where the debt was going to go. He said, we're going to run a surplus for 15 years. We're going to retire all of the government debt for the first time since 1837, which was Andrew Jackson. That was our first depression too. The very first time and only other time we were debt-free was in 1837. So he predicted we would do that. And at the Levy Institute, we wrote, no, we're not. We're going to go into recession and the deficit will return immediately, which is what happened. But anyway, so we had this. We didn't get a depression that time for the first time ever, but we got the global financial crisis. Oh, sorry, pointing the wrong thing right here. That's it. And the black is our domestic private sector. Okay, and that's virtually always above the line. This is average. You can find some quarters where there were government surpluses and private sector deficit, but no sustained ones until these right here, which was the dot-com bubble, and then the housing bubble and stock market bubble and commodities market bubble. All of those things led to lots of borrowing and the private sector in deficit. And then finally, the blue is the rest of the world. And as I said, we were running surpluses against the rest of the world. So that means the rest of the world is running a deficit. That's why it's negative. So the rest of the world, you know, mostly, there are a few here, but after Reagan, it's consistent. that the blue is above the line. So we're always running current account deficits. Implications for discretion over the budget. So there's this very strong belief that your policymakers can choose whether to have a deficit or not, that it's a policy choice to run deficits, okay? In reality, that's not true. Given the private sector's desire to accumulate saving, the US has to run larger deficits to account for the foreign surpluses. So that's what I was saying. So bigger deficits are baked in because of the accounting identity. The foreign sector's desire to accumulate net dollar assets. So for any level of desired domestic saving, now, normally the private sector wants to be and is a net saver. Now, the private sector has two components. One is households and the other is firms. Firms don't always want to be net savers. When firms are optimistic and they're investing a lot, they're net debtors, okay? Their income is less than their spending. So they're increasing their debt ratio. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as the economy is growing, right? And you make good investments. I have good graphs to show Japan. Japan, in its golden age period, the corporate sector was always in big deficits. Why? Well, they were expanding capacity. They were exporting to the world. Then in the 90s, they shifted over to become net savers. That's what killed the Japanese economy because they stopped spending. And the consumers generally in any country are going to be net savers. So households are net savers because they save for college and buy houses and, rainy day. So the consumers are net savers, and Japanese consumers are really big savers because they don't have a decent retirement system and they're all scared to death they're going to live for a long time. Okay, so they save. So anyway, they really needed the corporate sector to be net spenders, and they switched over. They've never been net spenders again. That's why they don't grow. But anyway, the case of the US, our household sector is always almost always a net saver, but they started becoming net spenders during those periods where the black was below the line. Our household sector started to be net spenders. They were taking on more and more debt. Steve Fazari has written about this. It's the rise of the consumer age, where it's actually the consumers driving the economy, not the corporate sector. Keynesian theory was always based on the idea that investment is the driver of the system. That's no longer true in the consumer age. Consumers are the drivers of the system now, which makes it more problematic, because when consumers borrow to spend, they're usually not increasing their capacity to produce, right? They're buying stuff. When firms are spending more than they're earning, they're increasing capacity. So it's okay for them to do it. It's not a good idea usually for the consumers to do it. Okay, so the big budget deficit is baked in because of our external sector. Now, discretion. To the degree the domestic private sector and the foreign sector have discretion, the government doesn't have discretion. So if you believe that consumers have discretion over whether to consume or save, and economic theory is based on this, that consumers make this decision about whether to consume or save. Okay, that's micro neoclassical economics. And if you believe that foreigners have some discretion over what they do, whether they import or export, then you are saying your government doesn't have discretion, right? Because the other two are making the decisions, and the government's budget outcome is a consequence of whatever those other two sectors do. Okay, now maybe it has some discretion, but it's constrained by the other two that have some discretion. So you can't just decide, well, let's stop running a deficit, because the balances have to balance. You can't stop running a deficit unless your domestic private sector decides to spend more, or foreigners decide to buy more of your output. If those things don't happen, you cannot reduce the size of the budget deficit. It's not discretionary. In functional finance, the government's budget balances the economy. So this is what Abba Lerner said. You're not trying to balance the government's budget. You're using the government's budget to balance the economy, to get reasonable economic growth and full employment without inflation. But much of the benefit of a government deficit is leaking out of the economy if you're running a current account deficit. This is what Minsky was worried about. Okay, our budget deficit is not increasing domestic capacity. It is enabling Americans to buy foreign output, and it is sending interest payments to foreigners. So it's not benefiting our economy. Supporting foreign savings desires. And if you know the Kolesky profit equation, the net exports come in as a positive contributor to profits. If you have negative net exports, it's reducing profits. So if you have a trade deficit, your profits are going abroad. So China has a trade surplus. It is getting profits by selling to us. So you're not only not increasing your own capacity, you're providing profits to foreigners, and you're allowing foreign consumers to save. It's not surprising that deficits and debt ratios have tended to rise with the USA's transition to becoming a big net importer. Okay, a couple more slides. A lot of times people will say the government is deficit spending, or the government shouldn't be deficit spending. There's no such thing as deficit spending. It's not a category. At the time you're spending, you're making keystroke credits. You have no idea whether you're going to be running a deficit or a surplus or a balanced budget. You tally it up at the end of the year. That's when you find out. Now we could have quarterly estimates, but you only know after the fact whether there's a deficit or not. There's no special kind of spending that we can identify as a deficit spending. All government spending looks exactly the same. I showed it yesterday. It's a keystroke credit by the central bank to a private bank's reserves. That's how the government spends. Whether the budget turns out to be balanced or surplus or deficit, it always looks the same. So at the moment that you're spending, there's no difference. Okay? There's no such special kind of spending called deficit spending. The deficit is ex post, comes after the fact. And as we already established, it's not discretionary. Okay, you don't choose whether to have a deficit or not. You choose how much you're going to spend. In the United States, we have a budgeting process that sets how much each program is going to spend. Okay, and they may not spend all of it, but they're going to come pretty close to spending that. And then we have mostly tax rates. Okay, tax rates just tell you what the rate is going to be. It doesn't tell you how much revenue you're going to get. So we will find out at the end of the year what the balance look like. The sustainability condition, interest rate below growth rate, is not a solvency constraint. The government can still make the payments even if the interest rate is above the growth rate. Okay, which it is, has been since Powell started raising the interest rate. We can still make those interest payments. Okay, it's not a solvency constraint. And if you look at the variables that go into determining the sustainability condition, the budget deficit, GDP, growth rate, and the interest rate, only one of those variables is discretionary. Okay, it's not the deficit, it's not GDP, it's not the growth rate. The only discretionary variable is the interest rate. We can set the interest rate. What that means is we can always have the interest rate below the growth rate because it's a discretionary variable. So I was talking about yesterday, your politicians, our Congress, can tell the central bank what the interest rate target is going to be. You can say, we want it below the growth rate. There's a rule, okay? And then you make all the neoclassical economists happy because you have the sustainability condition. I mean, personally, I don't care because I don't believe it's a sustainability question, but you can make them all happy by keeping the interest rate below the growth rate. I mean, as long as the growth rate is above zero, it's hard to get the interest rate negative. So as long as you're growing, you can have the interest rate below the growth rate. All right, so now taking all of this and reinterpreting what Minsky was worried about. Before Reagan, you could treat the USA as a closed economy. And I can tell you, as an economic student, we never talked about the rest of the world in the United States. Never. Never studied trade, never studied exchange rates. And that was common. There was no reason to. We were a closed economy, except for OPEC. Okay. So after Reagan, the trade deficit is normal. A government deficit equals the private sector surplus plus the current account deficit. Minsky's arguments were based essentially on a balanced current account. So he's worried only about the deficit and the surplus, private surplus. Given the current account deficit now, the budget deficit has to be larger to let the domestic private sector net save, or you get financial fragility. Okay, so that's one of his interests. When COVID hit, even many mainstream economists said, oh, we should do MMT now. So up until COVID, they said, MMT's crazy talk. The Japanese, I think he was the finance minister. He said, oh, we would never do MMT. And I wrote a paper arguing, well, hold it, Japan looks like the perfect example of it, MMT, running the biggest deficits in the world. That sounds like you guys must understand MMT. Anyway, they said, we're going to use MMT to finance the COVID response. And they were talking about helicopter money and saying, look, Japan is doing MMT, we ought to do it. But it's only for a crisis. We're only going to do it for the crisis. Otherwise, it's dangerous. You get hyperinflation and so on. Anyway, the problem is that COVID is going to be repeated. It will be some different disease that's being exposed up in the Arctic, you know, that's been buried for 10,000 years. There's going to be some new thing that comes along, but we have multiple problems. So yesterday I was talking about global warming. The rich countries have got to pay for this. And so we've got to understand what the real constraints are on government spending. MMT says there's only one way modern government spend, as I just said, crediting bank reserves, banks credit the deposits. That part is a description. It's not saying, oh, now we should start doing it the MMT way. No, we're saying that's the way governments always spend, okay? At the time, we were going back to Keynes's book on how to pay for the war and applying that to the necessary fiscal spending for the COVID pandemic, but all the other pandemics, including global warming. We can treat it the same way we treated spending for the war. And look at what they did. They understood the problem was not finding money for the war. The problem was going to be inflation. And so that's what people are worried about. So we need to see what Keynes had recommended and what governments actually did. So in this little pamphlet called How to Pay for the War, Keynes laid it out knowing that World War I was coming. So he says, we can always find the cash to pay for the purchases of home produced goods. Why? Well, you can use your own, you can use your own currency to buy your own stuff. You can't be positive you can buy stuff from other countries, but you can buy stuff you can produce. So focusing on that. So he says the problem comes afterward. The government's expenditure remains in the hands of the public. The government has taken goods out of the economy, but now the public has income. What are they going to buy? If the government has been buying up the output, what's left for consumers to buy? So there's nothing that they can spend on, so you'll get inflation. So Keynes recommended 3 principles. Use deferred compensation to reward workers. In other words, tell them, we're not going to pay you during the war. After the war is over, we're going to pay you. Okay, so you're going to get some kind of a bonus. The US did this. So we, unions, the government, and employers negotiated that workers would get benefits after the war ended. They couldn't get wage increases during the war. So that was to prevent inflation. And then they got health care and they got pensions. Those things came as the reward. So you defer the compensation. You can tax higher income because, they're just engaging in luxury consumption, right? They don't need to do it. So you can try taxing them, but you need to maintain adequate minimum standards for those with lower income. So he said, don't raise taxes on low income people. Okay, they're already making sacrifices for the war effort, but raising taxes on high income people is okay. We can also look at what institutionalists like Fag Foster said, who I mentioned yesterday. Whatever is technically feasible is financially possible. To the question, where's the money to come from? He says, there are only 2 institutions we allow to create money, the Treasury and the banks. So that's where the money is going to come from. And the rate at which they can increase it is a matter of policy. You can always decide to increase the supply. So resources, not finance, is the true constraint. Tackling multiple pandemics comes down to mobilizing the unemployed resources. So that's the first thing you want to do. Make sure you don't have any unemployed resources because you need to put everyone to work. We did that in the war. And we encouraged women to join the labor force, right? So we went way beyond what we thought was full employment. It turned out, yes, women can build ships. So you put everyone to work, and then you need to shift resources to the government's sector through taxes, postpone consumption, patriotic saving. Keynes was doubtful that this would work very well, but we all did it. We had patriotic saving, war bonds, and so on. Rationing, Keynes didn't like rationing either. He thought that it would drive up prices, and regulations and wage and price controls. Keynes really thought postponed consumption and taxes would be the most successful ones. Then the government spending allocates the resources. So in other words, allocating the resources is a spending question, is not a taxing question. The taxing question is to reduce use, and then you allocate with the spending. All right, conclusion. So summarizing, should we think of Minsky as one of the fathers, let's say, of MMT? Okay, the notion of anyone can create money, but there's a pyramid. Endogenous money approach, central bank, the main function of central banks, the most important function is lender of last resort, so it's financial stability. It's not controlling the money supply. And then the main target that they have adopted is interest rates. The role of finance in the economy needs to be directed toward efficient, productive uses rather than speculative uses. And worrying about the financial stability of the private sector. The credit and state money approach, taxes drive money for shorthand, or obligations drive demand for the currency. No solvency constraints. The problems are inflation, exchange rates, stability, and efficiency. So just because you can always afford it doesn't mean there aren't potential problems of spending more. And the sectoral balance approach, which was implicit in Minsky and then made it explicit by Godley. Directed demand, employer of last resort, jobs are the best way to get to full employment rather than training or any other method, and it's better than welfare. A bottom-up approach, lift the boats at the bottom. Focus on productive spending and productive activity, build in automatic stabilizers. People always worry, well, MMT doesn't seem to realize it's really hard to raise tax rates. Yeah, we do realize that. Because they think our answer to inflation is, well, if the government spends too much, you get inflation. Well, then you raise taxes. No, we don't say that. We know that takes too long. And in the United States, it's impossible. You set up the tax system and the spending so that you have strong automatic stabilizers. They're built in automatic. That's why we use the word automatic. It doesn't take discretion by Congress to make the budget move in the correct direction. Put ceilings and floors into the economy. Employer of last resort puts a floor to wages. Lender of last resort puts a floor to asset prices. So both of those are floors, help stabilize. And finally, international. In the international sphere, he was worried about the role of the dollar, and not only do you get advantages from having the international reserve currency, you also have responsibilities. Minsky wrote about this. He argued that if you're going to issue the international reserve currency, you need to act like a bank. You need to keep your position strong. You need the dollar to remain strong. You can't let it go weak because that will hurt the position of all the portfolios that are holding dollars, right? So you have to be responsible. And I would say there was one good thing that came out of the global financial crisis. The Fed did its job in bailing out the global financial system. And I know Minsky would have said that was the right thing to do. You have to be the lender of last resort to the whole world if you issue the international reserve currency. And then finally, he had an insufficient appreciation of the, I don't know how it can ring because my ringer is off. Anyway, insufficient appreciation of the impact of the current account deficit in that span of time between 86 and 96. Okay, all right, I'll stop. Okay. What?
Thank you. So I believe Minsky is coming from a position where the USA is the hegemonic country. No? How is working now that you have China, you have a multipolar world? This can keep doing? Well, I mean, we are watching USA getting into a new path, maybe. I don't know if the dollar is getting that strong, about this challenge to the SWIFT system. So how is next? What is next? No, I mean.
I was praising the Fed. Now the Fed is misbehaving, raising interest rates to fight inflation that had nothing to do with excess aggregate demand was the wrong policy. And if the US raises interest rates, other countries have to follow to protect their exchange rates. And so this is hurting, I know Latin America, the developing world in general, suffering with, if we raise ours to 4, you have to raise yours to 12. Okay, so it's very irresponsible. The Fed should not have done that. Now this is not the Fed, but US policy of putting sanctions on countries and excluding them from the international payment system, that reduces credibility in the dollar. Okay, so that's why we have movement in those directions. I think the US has made big mistakes. It's not appropriate for an international reserve currency country to unilaterally do these kinds of things. So it's a mistake. It leads to challenges. Do I think that some of the current currency is going to rise up? No, not in the near future. Alternative payment systems, possibly. There are, and if the US is going to behave this way, they're necessary. Does that really challenge the dollar? No, I don't think very much. Are people diversifying portfolios? Yes, they are. Again, I don't think that that's much of a problem. The US doesn't have to be the 75% of every portfolio in the world in order to maintain a strong position. And there is no rival to the US right now. That's the problem. And that's why I don't believe that it's going to have a significant impact. It took the US from from Civil War until the end of World War II to take over from Britain. Very long time, almost 100 years. We were the dominant economy in the world by the time of the Civil War. We had the biggest economy in the world. Britain is this tiny little island. It maintained dominance until the end of World War II. So what I'm saying is it can go on a lot longer than you would think. Why did it go on so long? Well, there was trust in the British legal system. There was trust in the commitment to keeping the pound strong. And so the world was willing to continue to use this currency that's issued by this tiny little unimportant country for a very long time before they switched to the US dollar. And right now, if you look, so Minsky thought it would be Germany. Okay, that can't happen. There's the euro. Can it be the euro? No, that can't happen. The euro land is a mess. And they are a net exporter, not a major net exporter, but an exporter. And what has changed between Britain and the United States is that people got pounds by borrowing. So when the pound was the international reserve currency, the way you got it was by borrowing, because it's a tiny little country. Okay, you're not going to be able to export enough to run the whole global financial system on exports to the UK. So you borrowed them. The US switched all that. You don't have to borrow dollars. You earn them. Countries would rather earn than borrow. You don't have to go into debt to get dollars. There's plenty of them. All you have to do is sell stuff to the United States. The United States is a huge buyer. Okay. Second biggest GDP in the world. We have high income we can buy. Okay. So it can't be a tiny country. But it can't be Euroland. Who are the possibilities? Okay. China is the biggest economy in the world. How much do global financial markets trust the Chinese legal system? They've got a ways to go. Okay. In political situations. So I don't see that happening. Now, is it inevitable? I'd say almost inevitable. But it could be 100 years. And I don't think India is in a position, Brazil's in Russia. No, don't think so. So I don't see that. Don't see how it's going to happen. Now, there's always this dream of an international currency unit, which was Keynes' proposal, the Bancor. Brilliant proposal. How's it going to happen? Russia, China, United States, India, are any of them going to support it? No, they're not going to. They don't want to give up sovereignty because the fundamental problem is you have to surrender sovereignty because somebody's going to make those decisions, not you. Right now, we make all the decisions about the dollar. We're not going to give that up. China makes decisions about RMB. They're not going to give it up. Keynes said in a footnote to his proposal, we might need a global central bank. Okay, who's going to run that? I don't see any political way to get there. Even if it's the best possible proposal anybody can think of, it's politically not feasible. So I think the dollar will stay there for quite a while. And I just hope the US will start behaving better.
Thank you again. These last comments are giving me food for thought, and I guess I'll start from there. Couple different questions, but first, the idea. I'm very interested in the idea of hegemony, and that you're mentioning that it seems like the U.S. dollar, for now at least, in the foreseeable, is hegemonic, and one of the, I guess, as China displaces the U.S. in productive capacity via that dollar, is one of the remaining ways in which the United States maintains global hegemony. You mentioned the trust in the Chinese legal system. I would wonder about China's responses, for example, to tariffs are not via their own legal system, but rather via the World Trade Organization. And is actually, it's kind of interesting as the United States is stepping back from the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's China which is stepping up to provide backing for and establish that as the globally respected. Whether or not that's the case is another story, but it would seem that the legal structure that they're proposing that the world adhere to is the World Trade Organization, among others, with its Western origins. So I'm curious if you could comment on that first, and then also I took notes on I'm trying to translate the conceptual framework to Latin America, to Latin American countries, and to what extent it is translatable and to what extent it's hard to translate. Considering the idea we were talking yesterday and following up on Professor Duarte's question yesterday about the idea of sovereign currency, thinking of sovereignty not as black and white, but rather as shades of gray, and to what extent Latin American countries are able to impose their sovereignty over their own currencies, or to what extent dependency is a criteria that we should put at the forefront. As far as just the idea of any Latin American central bank adding keystrokes to their account, the idea that government, that there is no risk in government, in the keystroke logic, I don't know. I haven't found that, at least in Latin American. I lived in Venezuela for a few years, and I saw what happened to the Bolivar, where the value of that currency was determined not by the Venezuelan state, but by websites in South Florida. And there's an entire geopolitical agenda, which I think, I feel like I'm trying to do this translation and I'm having a hard time. You mentioned yesterday the Treasury Department, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which is able to dictate which countries are not able, which are and are not able to use the dollar. The credit rating agencies, following up on another question, that have an extremely powerful impact in determining the level of sovereignty that Latin American countries are able to use over their own currencies. The dollar you mentioned right now as the international reserve currency. I just don't think that's to be. I just feel like a lot of this is quite easily and directly translated to the United States economy. I'm just having a hard time making that jump to Latin American economies because there are so many other international actors which have an enormous, the idea of debt, that there's not an inherent problem in accumulating debt, where the last 40 years of Latin American history debt has been so central in determining the the capacity of governments to determine their own jobs program. I'm thinking of, you mentioned Latin American countries as importers of energy and food. I'm thinking, why is Mexico right now a net importer of corn? Where does that come from? And I can't answer that question without going back to NAFTA, 1994, the devastating impact of eliminating subsidies to corn production in Mexico versus, US subsidizing agro exportation of corn to Mexico. So there's a whole host of other issues, which so if you could help translate this to Latin America, and some of these other issues that I'm seeing that I can't get beyond, I can't get over. So anyway, thanks so much. I want to ask other questions about Trump and your thoughts on Trump as well, but I'll save that for later. That's a whole nother series of questions.
Well, some MMT people have used this framework of a continuum of degrees of sovereignty. And so that's one way to do it, to say that some countries have greater sovereignty in their currency issue than others. Another way to look at it is that countries face different kinds and different degrees of constraints on them. If you can be self-sufficient, then you're freer of some kinds of constraints. If you are a Latin American country that is producing some kind of crop for export, and you're competing with other Latin American countries that happen to produce the same crop for export, then you're facing a very strict constraint if you're extremely reliant on that one thing. So I think either one is a plausible way to explain the difference between a rich developed country and a country that is developing. You say it's a spectrum of sovereignty, or they face constraints that rich developed countries don't face. On the international organizations, of course, they may mean well, they also may not mean well. It's a good idea to have agreements, but they're difficult to enforce. They're not always in the interests of countries that want to try to get around them. And it seems to me they're fairly ineffectual. I'm not an expert at all, but I have been in the audience with progressive, severe criticism of the WTO as being ineffective. So I can't really comment on that. The problem is that the biggest players just refuse to go along, and they get away with it. And I'm including, of course, the United States. So it would be nice if they were more effective and if they could try to play fair. But there always was an ideology behind each one of these. And for the past 30 to 40 years, that ideology is that trade is good, that free markets are good, that we should be promoting this. And that's probably actually not true. And I think there's a recognition that the age of neoliberalism, which is what we've all been living in, it really is over. It has ended. And we'll see what comes after. It could be worse. It could be better. But I think we're in a position like 1930, where the age of laissez-faire was over. I think we're the end of free trade. It's over. The end of free capital flows, which was, the other side of the deal, And free capital flows, I think, were never in the interests of developing countries, but you sort of had to buy that to get the free trade, right? Free trade maybe would have benefited developing countries, but with capital flows, they don't. But anyway, probably both of those things are in question, whether we're going to go forward with those. So the future could be better. I think given the position in the hierarchy of currencies, that countries should not have their capital markets open. All it does is, like you said, it lets somebody else set your exchange rate. So that probably always was a bad idea. And you notice China will open up a bit, and then when there's a flow out, they shut it back down. I think China is pursuing policy that's in its own self-interest, and hey, that's what countries ought to do. Do things that are in your own self-interest, and opening up your capital markets is probably not. It may be fine for the United States and UK to develop financial markets, and it's a big part of their economy to be centers for that sort of thing. Now, I don't think it's in Britain's interest anymore at all, nor in the United States, but for a long time it's been seen as a benefit to us.
Pues le damos las gracias por haber venido a la sesión de hoy. Nos tenemos que ir rápido porque bueno, tenemos que comer y tenemos la conferencia a las 5 en la facultad. Entonces, si nos gustan acompañar, son bienvenidos. Recuerden que es en la facultad, ¿no? Ahí donde está toda la gente y toda la civilización. En el Narciso Basols, que es el auditorio grande del edificio B, ¿no? Entonces los esperamos, nos vemos en un ratito. Muchas gracias.